Remember that the major difference between a eukaryotic cell and a prokaryotic cell is the presence of a structure called a nucleus. Now, the nucleus is what we call an organelle. An organelle is basically a little compartment within the cell that performs a specific function. So this video is going to talk about the function of a variety of different organelles that are found within our eukaryotic cell types. Now remember, two major types of eukaryotic cells are the animal cells and the plant cells. Now the majority of the organelles are going to be the same between the two animal and plant cells. So over here we've got all of these structures that are found in both animals and plants. We have this one little centriole not found in plants. And then if we look at the plants, again, we have these organelles that are the same. The cell that they've shown us looks very similar, with the exception of a few really important organelles. But we're going to talk about these. We're going to talk about their functions. Now I'm going to do my best to make this exciting, but it's basically a laundry list of structure and function. Now I always get asked, do I actually have to know these? Yes, you actually have to know them. Most of them are pretty straightforward. We're not going to go into huge detail on what each of these are, but I do want you to understand the basic function of these organelles. So let's start with the nucleus. The nucleus is probably the most important organelle in a eukaryotic cell. It's the largest one, and it's the easiest to see when we look at a microscope image of a cell. So the nucleus has two primary functions. One is that it's the genetic control center, and the other is that it houses our genetic information. This means that it's the location of our DNA. So it houses the instructions for the building and the functioning and the maintaining of the cell, which means that the nucleus in all of our cells, where it's storing, our DNA is being stored, is critical to the function of all of our cells. Now, all of our cells contain all of our genetic information, and we'll talk about what that means a little bit later. But let's talk about the structure and the function of the nucleus. So within the nucleus, within the cell, we have this large structure. It's always represented as purple in our book, and you can see that it's in this picture, it's sort of round. Within it is a region called the nucleolus. Now the nucleolus is where ribosomes are made. We're going to come back to ribosomes a little bit later. I'm not super worried about whether or not you know what all goes on in the nucleolus. It's important in making the ribosomes, and that's really all I need you to know. Outside of the nucleolus are our chromatin or our chromosomes. So chromatin is basically a complex of DNA and protein. Chromosomes are our long, thin fibers of DNA, and that is the information center for all of our genetic material. So the nucleus has to house all of this DNA, and it has to maintain it. So in order for a cell to properly pass on all of this genetic information when the cell divides, it needs to be taken care of, it needs to be maintained, and it needs to be replicated properly. On the outside of the nucleus are these pores. So just like our plasma membrane, there are pores for stuff to move in and out. This quote-unquote stuff is actually a small bit of genetic information that is taken from our DNA and is going to be used to make proteins for us later. So here's a diagram of our nucleus. It is made up of a phospholipid bilayer type membrane with pores in the center. So this nucleus sort of mirrors the shape and function of the plasma membrane. Outside of the nucleus, we have the cytoplasm, which is sort of this jelly-like fluid that fills the cell and helps to support it a little bit. All of the other organelles, all of the gray structures that are shown here, are actually sort of suspended within the cytoplasm. Now remember, the plasma membrane is sort of almost flimsy. It's actually not, but it's really flexible, it's really thin. So the majority of the structure, particularly in an animal cell where we don't have a cell wall, actually comes from the cytoskeleton. So the cytoskeleton is basically a scaffolding inside the cell that provides shape, structure, support for that plasma membrane. Organelles and vesicles and cellular products can move through the cytoplasm, basically along cytoskeleton tracks. So not only does it provide support and shape, but it also acts as sort of a road system or a traffic system within the cell. So the cytoskeleton is made up of 3 different types of fibers, all of which are basically a long hollow tube or rod-like fiber that can be disassembled and moved around. So the cytoskeleton is not like our skeleton where it's always one shape. It can actually be disassembled and moved. So the tracks within the cytoplasm can be moved. The structural support for the organelles can be moved. If the cell has to move or change its shape, the cytoskeleton is moved as well. So the 3 different types of fiber that we have are the microtubules, which are the largest of the cells. They are a hollow tube-shaped cell. And these are the ones along which molecules in or organelles in the cell can be moved. They may be attached for support within the cytoplasm. Then slightly smaller, we have intermediate filaments. This is kind of a rope-like system that gives the cell some of its structure and strength. And then we have microfilaments that are really small rod type fibers, and these are important when we get to cell division. So actually changing the shape of the cell so that it can divide. Sometimes cells have projections on the outside that help them move fluid around the cell or to actually allow the cell to move. So depending on the function, we have 2 different types of projections. We have cilia that are basically little finger-like projections on the outsides of cells that move in a way that causes fluid to flow past the cell. So we talked about cystic fibrosis in the last video very briefly. One of the things that happens in cystic fibrosis is that buildup of mucus actually causes cilia to break down, and so they can't move the mucus along. So it's sort of this problem that continues to amplify as the mucus builds up, the cilia break down, and so the cilia can't move the fluid, which is why you get the fluid buildup along the lungs. Some small single-celled eukaryotic organisms actually can use cilia as sort of a almost like a rowboat type oar to move all their cilia in a consistent beating pattern, which allows the cell to move. We also have flagella, which are long microtubule structures that allow cells to move. So these are sperm cells here on the left, and the flagella use ATP, our energy currency in the cell, to beat, which causes the sperm to move through the cells. I'm sorry, the sperm to move wherever it needs to go. In this case, it's going through the female reproductive system. But there are many other types of organisms that use cilia and flagella for movement. In the human body, cilia is really important for fluid movement. Flagella are really the only the only cells in the human body that use, I'm sorry, sperm are the only cells in the human body that use flagella. So once we now that we have talked about the cytoskeleton and the cytoplasm, which is sort of our support system for all of the components of the cell, we can start talking about some of the other organelles. So mitochondria are really important organelles because they are the site of energy conversion. So they take energy from the food we eat. So let's say sugar. So let's say you've ingested some glucose in your breakfast and now your body needs to use it. Your body can't use sugar directly. First, it has to convert it into ATP, which is the energy currency for our cell. So the mitochondria basically brings in the sugar molecules and converts it into energy that the cell can use. And then that energy can be used in different cellular functions. So it might be movement of something along a cytoskeleton track. It might be active transport, moving things in or out. It might be mechanical movement, so movement of muscle cells. And you'll find that if you look at the composition of different types of cells in your body, they have different quantities of mitochondria. So cells that require a lot of energy, like your muscles or your brain, also have a high number of mitochondria. Other cell types don't require as much energy and therefore don't have as many mitochondria inside of them. So the number of mitochondria varies per cell. And as I said a few minutes ago, cells that require more energy are going to have more mitochondria. So this chart shows the relative number of mitochondria per cell. So we've got liver cells require a lot of energy. Skeletal muscle cells. So those are, think of things like your calves, your biceps, things like that. These are the big muscles that move your body. And then we've got some other cell types. Getting down to skin cells, we have a lower number of mitochondria. Fat storage cells, red blood cells, those don't need nearly as much mitochondria because the cell themselves has lower energy needs. Now remember, we talked about something called endosymbiosis. So endosymbiosis is the theory for the appearance of the mitochondria and the chloroplasts. These are two organelles that both have their own DNA. They have their own ribosomes, which is going to be the site of protein production. And researchers believe that both of these became organelles via the process of endosymbiosis. So essentially, endocytosis brought in a smaller prokaryotic organism that then developed a symbiotic relationship with the engulfing cell. So the precursor to mitochondria may have originally been a single-cell bacterial-like organism. And we think this because they have their own DNA. An interesting fact about the mitochondria is that sperm don't have mitochondria. And so any mitochondria that you get in cell division is going to come from your mother. So mitochondrial DNA can actually be used to track lineage through a female. So you may have heard about something called the mitochondrial Eve. It's this quote-unquote ancestral female that would have passed her mitochondrial DNA down to all individuals who are living on Earth today. And that's because sperm don't have the mitochondria. So any mitochondria that you get is going to come from your mother. So let's talk about an experiment that was done that shows how cells can adapt to their environment.